Just making sure I've got all my documents in order, which is rare, having a 2-year-old and expecting another one. This Sunday, we were sitting around my older sister's living room when her phone rang. I noticed she had answered it with the same laughter she normally greets my little sister with. "How are you doing?" the daughter of Nyuon Ban. And then shortly after, she went quiet and she began to cry. So I asked her what was wrong, and she looked at me and said, "Grandma." I knew from how she had said it that my grandma had died in Ethiopia. You will see as I give this speech pictures of my grandmother kneeling and praying. I took them in 2013. That was the first time I've met her since not seeing her 20 years before. When I shared these pictures with the organizers of this event, she was still here, and I thought I had time. I thought I still had time to learn more about her after 20 years of separation. I thought I still had time for my children to see her so that she can bless them and she can love them. I thought there was still time for my children to learn about this formidable woman, this fierce woman who had raised 20 grandchildren and now had 10 great-grandchildren. I had hoped she would hear the voice of my husband and the laughter of my child, but none of that will happen. Instead, my grandmother is dead, and she died without any or most of immediate family around her. And mostly, I blame war and conflict. War had robbed my grandmother of a dignified death. It has scattered most of her children and grandchildren around the world so that we could not wrap our arms around her in our final moments. And we could not bury her. We will never get to see her for the last time, and the only thing that will be left is a grave marking where she laid. This is what war does. It normalizes what should not be normal. We are here today because of what war and conflict does. What it does to nations, to cities, to towns, and to communities. What it does to families, and in the case of torture and harm, what it does to individuals. The wounds it leaves behind that can go so deep that they shatter the most inner pieces of who we are. We are here to remember the humanity of those whose humanity might have been diminished, and to support and find ways to help restore and replenish that humanity. It is the reason I accepted the invitation to speak here today, because I believe stories are important. And if we tell stories well, we can be able to change perceptions and create an environment where empathy can strive. And if by telling my story, I can assist in this way, then it is worth telling. I have to admit, however, that I'm still quite nervous whenever I'm invited to this event, because it's a little over a decade ago since my family and I arrived in Australia. So often when I find myself in a room like this, with much more distinguished people than I am, I often feel that maybe it's still a dream. Having been born and raised in refugee camps, nothing in my early circumstances would have suggested I'll be standing here today. It is never lost on me that only 13 years ago, my family and I lived in an overcrowded refugee camp in northern Kenya. And only 13 years ago, many of my dreams and goals were distant and appeared impossible. 13 years ago, I was stateless. I was considered stateless because since my birth, the life of my community, my family and I had been disrupted by years of war, and for a long time we knew no other life. We were considered displaced people, soon homeless people, without a country to protect them or to claim them. And as a result, like many people my age, I ended up in Kakuma refugee camp where I spent most of my childhood. That refugee camp had no running water, no electricity, and barely met our basic needs for survival. My family depended on food rations distributed fortnightly by the United Nations. My mother, a single mother of 7 children, was desperate to get us out. And I say she wanted to get us out because I believe my mom never wanted to leave her people and her culture behind. But she knew without escaping the conditions of Kakuma, we will never have a future. It is not an exaggeration to say my mother sacrificed her life, at least the life she would have had, so that we grew up with some dignity and hope. And one thing she wanted more than anything else was that we have an education. I attended Kakuma Secondary College, one of the 3 secondary colleges serving a refugee camp of over 90,000 people. And I recall sitting in a classroom of 60 to 80 students, crunching each other on small desks, trying to see the blackboard. There were only 4 girls in my class, and I was the loudest. I think I'm still the loudest in most rooms. But it was not the overcrowding in the overheated classrooms that was the main problem. It was the fact that each day, in suffocating heat and occasional dust storms, I would walk for nearly an hour to get to school, and my mom thought that was enough, so she bought me a bicycle. You have to remember that we had little, very little, but my mother decided to buy me a bicycle. And for me, it felt like she took food from the table and placed it as wheels beneath me so that I can fly. It is a moment I recall often, a moment that shows the length that any parents would go to make sure that their children survive even in the harshest of conditions. It was also my mom who had the fortitude to apply to bring us to Australia. And in doing so, she was leaving her language, her identity, and her status behind to give us a new life. We commenced our application to come here in about 2000. And as we waited to hear from Australian Immigration Office, I recall my mother singing gospel songs and praying each night, pleading that our application be approved. Sometimes I sang along with her, but mostly I listened silently, waiting for my turn to persuade God on the wisdom of letting my family come to Australia. When my mom stopped completely and had prayed and gone to bed, I then took over. I had waited until Mom had finished singing and praying because I believed that God would be in a better mood. When all was quiet, so quiet that I could hear my thoughts, I began the negotiations, and I pleaded and promised with God that if I made it to Australia, I would get a university education, I'll be a very, very good Christian, and I'll always be grateful and never complain. I also made the worst promise of my life, which was that I'll always faithfully listen to my mom. I was desperate, as you can see, and at the time, I was in my final year of secondary school education, and I knew if I didn't get out of that camp, it was going to be very hard for me to pursue further education. There was no university in Kakuma, and I knew Mom could not afford paying for a university out of the camp. And I was very lucky. I stand here as one of the very, very lucky people, because I did make it to Australia, and I did get a university education. However, I have found myself complaining when Melbourne trams run about 2 minutes or so late. So I haven't really stuck to all my promises. But since arrival, our lives have changed dramatically. Within 13 years, we've moved from being stateless and refugees to enjoying the privilege and the protections of being Australian citizens. I now have a passport, and I recall a moment at Melbourne Airport where one of the immigration officers looked at my Australian passport and said, "Welcome home." I finally had a home. Within those 13 years, I've moved from sitting in overcrowded classrooms to graduating from the University of Melbourne. And on May 2016, I achieved a long-held dream of becoming an Australian lawyer, something that I'd wanted since I was 14 years old. I know very well that all these dreams would have not been possible without the generosity of so many people that have supported me since arrival. But more importantly, they are dreams that would have not been possible without the opportunity to have been resettled in Australia, an opportunity that I'm well aware of millions of people around the world are hoping for. I share my story today because I think it demonstrates what many refugee stories have shown before, which is that given a small window of opportunity, many will turn it into a lifetime of achievements. In the current political climate across the world where people fleeing persecution are vilified and prevented from seeking asylums, and where they're regarded with suspicion and subjected to punishment, we cannot lose sight that it's people just like me, not numbers, not statistics, and not headlines that we're talking about, that we're sitting here about today. I've often wondered of the children in detention centers in Australia here, if given the opportunity, how many would, like me, make their big, impossible dreams come true? How many, like the many refugees in the past, could become businessmen or doctors who might find the next cure of cancer or change this very country for the best? And I wonder about how many never get the chance to try and instead will remain those terrible numbers and statistics. I know from personal experience that many refugees take the dangerous road to safety, that many cross dangerous and unpredictable seas for the chance of having their children strive. And as put so eloquently by the British Somali poet, Wassan Shai, this is not an easy decision to make, because no one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. You only run for the border when you see your whole country running as well. No one leaves home unless home chases you, fire under your feet, and hot blood in your belly. You have to understand, no one put their children in a boat unless the water is safer than the land. What Wassan Shai writes is painfully true, but so is the resilience of so many refugees. And I stand here today as an example of what the generosity of a nation can afford someone who was once considered stateless. I stand here today as a statement of what, given a chance, many can do and achieve. I hope for those who continue to do this very difficult job, many of you sitting in this room today, that events like this are able to renew your spirit and inspiration to keep doing this job. For we must keep on speaking for and on behalf of those whose voice remain unheard. I say purposefully unheard because everyone has a voice. However, we still live in a world where we are yet to value all voices equally. We must continue to advocate for the displaced, for the vulnerable, because in the current political environment, it is vital that we do not lose hope. I often recall a quote by one of my favorite authors, Toni Morrison's, "When times are dark and I feel a bit defeated." And it says, "There is no time for despair, no place for self-pity, no need for silence, no room for fear. We speak, we write, we do language. That's how civilizations heal." I also urge you to remember, for those who continue to do this work and who are here today, that we are made for these times. And here again, I borrow words and language from people who say it better than I can. I want to end with an encouraging essay by Clarissa Pinkola, where she writes, "My friends, do not lose hope. We were made for these times. I've heard from so many recently who are deeply and properly bewildered. They are concerned about the state of affairs in the world now. Ours is a time of almost daily astonishment and often righteous rage over the latest degradation of what matters most to civilized and visionary people. You are right in your assessment. Some have aspired to, while endorsing acts so hideous against children, elders, everyday people, the poor, the unguarded, the helpless. Yet I urge you and ask you gently, to please not spend your spirit dry by bewailing these difficult times. Especially do not lose hope, most particularly because the fact is that we were made for these times. In any dark time, there is a tendency to veer towards fainting over how much is wrong or unmended in the world. Do not focus on that. There's a tendency, too, to fail into being weakened by dwelling on what is outside your reach, by what cannot yet be. Do not focus there. There is spending the winds without raising the sails. Ours is not the task of fixing the entire world at once, but of stretching out to mend the parts of the world that is within our reach. Any small, calm thing that one soul can do to help another soul, to assist some portion of this poor, suffering world will help immensely. It is not given to us to know which acts or by whom will cause the critical mass to tip towards an enduring good. There will always be times when you feel discouraged. I too have felt despair many times in my life, but I do not keep a chair for it. I will not entertain it. It is not allowed to eat from my plate. I hope you forgive me if I sound so aspirational. I've tried to share my story, not because it's the most important story or the most interesting story, but merely to demonstrate how people who come from some of the most harshest situations can rise. And I think it's partly what we're doing here today, to remember those people who have survived and to find ways of making sure we help others in the future. But I'm also aspirational because in some ways I am still that refugee girl. I'm still that child who used to lay on my back daydreaming about the impossible, and yet I stand here having had the great fortune of having many of those impossible dreams and goals come true. For to be a refugee, I think in so many ways, is to still have hope in the face of crushing impossibilities. Ladies and gentlemen, everyone in this room, distinguished guests, thank you very much for having me. May we continue and hope and advocate for a world that is better for all of us. And to Karen, who I have promised to send this speech to since 2 months ago, I hope it was worth the wait. Thank you.